And this is the Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 20th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, the disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. The Gospel of the Lord. At least a couple of times a week, they arrive in my inbox, or at least in my spam folder. They are the emails that announce good news. Apparently, I have won thousands of dollars in a lottery that I never entered. All that's required of me to claim the prize is to pay a small processing fee. Or it's the good news that someone I don't know, no one knows, wants to donate $2 million to our church. All I need to do is send them our bank account information. Of course, I recognize these things not as good news, but rather as what they really are, scams. So often, what claims to be good news in our lives isn't really good news, but people preying on the hopes and wishes of vulnerable people. And so I understand why Thomas didn't buy into this good news that Jesus was alive. Now, I don't think that Thomas thought that his friends were trying to scam him, but it is the case that sometimes people who are deep in grief and are desperate and vulnerable think they see things that really aren't there. Denial is the first stage of grief. And lots of us, after having lost someone close to us, will in the weeks and months after that person's death see people who bear an uncanny resemblance to the person we've lost, or hear a voice that sounds just like the voice of our loved one. It's understandable for Thomas to have decided that Mary Magdalene and the other disciples, well, they may have truly believed that they saw Jesus, but it was just someone from a distance who looked like him or sounded like him. It happens all the time, almost as often as I get scam emails, and for that very reason, it was hard to believe the good news as real. It also happens in my life, and maybe in yours, that I am constantly inundated with bad news. I open my news feed, and there is a whole string of stories about the latest tragedy, disaster, or outrage. I'm deeply affected by the pain and suffering of my own life and the lives of others I care about. And even when there seems to be good news, like good news on the vaccine front, the headlines tell us how bad things could still get before they get better. There is actually good news out there. But the bad news seems overwhelming. It's oppressive and soul-crushing. And if I'm not careful, it can be so all-consuming that I have a hard time even noticing the good news. It's understandable why Thomas had a hard time appropriating the good news in his life. After all, he is the only guy in the story who hadn't had an opportunity to see Jesus. He's been dealing with the personal pain of losing Jesus in his life, and he's probably been trying to figure out how to dodge people who want to kill him, while he's one of the only ones brave enough to go outside the house and go run the errands. And it's hard. It really is hard to really appropriate good news when you're so consumed and crushed by the bad news of pain and loss. And honestly, after living with so much bad news all the time, it's sometimes hard to even expect good news. After all, much of life follows a pattern of death and decay. Stuff eventually wears out. People we love die. Relationships we had cherished drift apart or end. If enough of that stuff happens in a row, it's hard for me to even look for a better future, or to think that a better future is even possible. And of all the disciples, Thomas seems to have been particularly fatalistic in his outlook. He was, after all, the guy who just a few weeks before encouraged his friends to go back to Jerusalem with Jesus when they heard that Lazarus was sick, so that, as Thomas said, we can die with him. Thomas, at least, seemed to have paid attention to Jesus' prediction that he would die in Jerusalem. And Thomas expected the end for himself and for his friends as well. The first part of that had come true, and so he expected more bad news. And it's hard to even expect good news when you've grown to expect the worst. On this second Sunday of Easter, we always read this story from John's Gospel of these first two appearances of the risen Jesus to the disciples in the locked room. It includes the story of Thomas refusing to believe the good news because he hadn't seen Jesus. But of course, nobody else in this story believed until they saw Jesus either. And instead of wondering, what is wrong with Thomas, which is often how we read this story, I think it's good to see in Thomas the reasons that believing good news is so hard. It's not a modern problem that only we have. Ancient people had this problem too, and as we celebrate Easter, it's important to recognize how hard it often is for us also to see, appropriate, and expect God's good news in our lives. So, rather than seeing Thomas as the guy who didn't believe, maybe it's helpful to look at Thomas as the guy who successfully dealt with all the hindrances to believing the good news. And while we can't know exactly what was going through Thomas's heart or mind, it's clear that Thomas was eventually able to believe the good news not just because he saw Jesus, but because he kept listening for the good news, even when all he was expecting was bad news. I mean, he debated with the other disciples about, I'm not sure this is right, I'm not going to, but he kept listening and hoping for some good news. This is why, I realize in the challenges of my life, trying to believe or listen for good news, it's hard, right? And it's why sometimes to combat that in my life, I open my news feed and I will go through 40 stories before I find something that's like, oh wow, that looks like good news. And I will resist the clickbait that says, oh my gosh, look at this is terrible, this is horrible, yet another bad thing happened. Just because sometimes you need to listen for the good news. Part of the reason I think Thomas was eventually able to hear the good news was that he kept looking for and listening for the good news even when it didn't seem likely in his life. And I think Thomas, he was able to believe, finally, the good news, not just because he saw Jesus, but because he didn't give up and go home. I mean, after all, he was brave enough to venture out. He could have decided, you know what? These guys are crazy. They think they see Jesus. This isn't true. I'm going to go home to Galilee. I'm going to sit and sulk in the bad news. But he didn't. He stuck with them. He didn't let the bad news be so oppressive that he wouldn't stick with the people who were trying to help him find the good news. Somehow he struggled not to let the bad news define his life. And this is often hard for us. It's one of the reasons, especially when the news in my life is particularly bad or oppressive, that I try to actually begin prayer every evening by thanking God for 3 things that I'm really thankful for, 3 good things that have happened in my life. There are days when it's hard, but there's always good things happening if you don't let the bad news completely overwhelm you. Struggling against letting that happen is part of opening yourself up to the good news of God in your life. And I think that Thomas, not just because he saw Jesus, was able to believe the good news because when he finally did see the good news, the risen Jesus, the good news in the flesh, he was able to recognize the good news as a life-changing experience, something that showed him a new way forward. See, it wasn't that he just had the information, okay, yes, now I technically believe that Jesus is alive. He saw that Jesus being alive in his life pointed him to a way forward. It changed and transformed him. And in fact, he may be the only person in the story who really gets how much that's going to change and transform his life. He says when he sees Jesus and he recognizes the reality, he calls him my Lord and my God. He's the only person in the Gospel of John who actually calls Jesus God. Others have said, you're from God, you're the Son of God, you're the Lord, you're the Messiah. But at the very beginning of John's Gospel, John begins by saying Jesus is one with God. Jesus is God. Only Thomas, by the time that he sees Jesus, recognizes, my gosh, Jesus is God in my life. This is going to change my life. This is going to give me hope beyond all the pain and the suffering that I've been living with. So he thought, he went from being this guy who thought Jesus is just leading us to death to now experiencing Jesus is the guy who leads us into life, and I'm part of that. This is why often it's important for us as well to actually expect God to give us new life. To see new life not just as the information that Jesus is alive and someday we'll be alive with God in heaven, but actually to expect that God is going to give us new life right now, not just in heaven, but right now, even beyond whatever bad news or pain or suffering we're dealing with right now. If we're actually able to struggle so that we look and expect that kind of good news, it's more likely that we'll actually be able to experience it. Easter is about good news. But we've all been inundated and so often consumed by the bad news around us. And so it's important to realize in our lives, not just the lives of the disciples, that the good news is often, for us too, hard to see and appropriate and expect. But like Thomas, even when we haven't physically seen the risen Jesus, God's good news is actually present in our lives right now. And the risen Jesus is working to show us new life, whether we see it or not, whether we appreciate it or not, and whether we expect it or not. That's God's promise to us, as well as to those first disciples. And since that's the case, we should see hope in the story of Thomas. For Thomas shows us not only that the good news is real, but that it's possible for us to hear the good news if we keep listening for it. It's possible to experience the good news when we're willing to struggle not to let the bad news consume and define us. And it's possible to live into the good news when we have the boldness to expect that God's good news will actually change and transform our lives as well. Amen.